So after such an eventful Sunday, there is still plenty for us to talk about Monday, especially as it pertains to the Crimson Tide, because last night the Crimson Tide got a commitment from four-star running back LeVeon Moss, one of the top prospects in all of high school football, but that's not all of the good news for the Tide, because multiple prospects have sounded off about their time in Tuscaloosa and how much they enjoyed it. Nick Saban signed a contract extension, and then to cap it all off, Alabama was named as the #1 institution in player development, and there's a stat that was listed that I think is incredibly telling that I really want to focus on and talk about. But before we do, as always, y'all know the drill. I want to hear from y'all. Hop down to the comments, give me a Y for yes or an N for no. Are you excited that LeVeon Moss is now a part of this Crimson Tide class? And let me know what you're thinking there. If you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe, hit that bell notification because I do constant college football content and you don't want to miss any of it. And if you enjoy that content, be sure to like, comment down below. Those interactions are massive for content creators such as myself. But with all that being said, let's kick this off with LeVeon Moss, the newest addition to the Crimson Tide recruiting class, hailing from Louisiana. LeVeon Moss is a four-star running back standing 6 foot, 190-ish pounds, and he's got some really nice top-end speed. I mean, this guy right here, when you first see him, he's a really stout kid. But then when you watch his tape and you see how he's able to escape defenders, this kid right here has got a ton of upside, and Crimson Tide fans have got to be ecstatic that he is a member of this class, because the Crimson Tide's class now sits just outside the top 10 at 12. However, it's very important to note, and it's something I bring up every time I talk about the Alabama Crimson Tide class, that they still have the #1 class if we're looking at the average rating of each recruit. Alabama sitting at a 94.77, which would give them the #1 class if we just evaluated the average rating per recruit in that class. The Crimson Tide sitting outside the top 10 are outside the top 10 right now because they just simply don't have as many guys in the class as other institutions, but that looks to change, and LeVeon Moss is a massive addition to this class, and when I say that means to change, that kind of gets me into my second point that I want to talk about here, which is the guys sounding off about their time in Tuscaloosa. I want to kick it off with a prospect in 2023, LT Overton. Now, LeVeon Overton is the #1 player in the class of 2023, and apparently he was blown away by his time in Tuscaloosa. Now, this is a prospect that I've talked about at length, and I've talked about how this is going to be such an interesting battle, with family ties to multiple top-tier institutions across the nation, including the Crimson Tide, and his family talked about that, how they have always been amazed at what Nick Saban has been able to build at Alabama, and you look up years later, even though they aren't in Tuscaloosa anymore, and it's more of the same, of Saban still churning out results both in the win column, the national championship column, and in the draft column, all three of which are very important to LT Overton. And then even further than that, Saban was very cognizant to talk about this young man outside of football, what life means outside of football, and that's something Overton is big on. This is a really, really thoughtful kid. This is a kid that is going to just help any college he steps into, because if you look at his stats, it's mind-blowing. But Crimson Tide fans should be feeling very, very good about this visit, because Steve Wiltfong put on 24/7 Sports that the Crimson Tide may have set the standard in this battle. Important to note, this is still a long battle. We still have a long time. His recruiting class isn't even the one up, but that's a great place to be. I always talk about planting the seed early, and it looks like the Crimson Tide planted a very, very positive seed early, and when you mix that with the family ties, you have to really like where the Crimson Tide sit for LT Overton, even though this is a long ways off. But if we want to focus on prospects that are closer to home, we can focus on guys such as Adam Anderson, Barrion Brown, and then a guy such as Shamar James, all of which just loved their time at the institution, all of which are very big prospects for the coaching staff. And when we look at a Barrion Brown, that speed he possesses is just something that the Crimson Tide coaching staff have continued to talk about. And you know, even though they got in a JoJo Earl, even though they got in a Christian Leary and then a Jamison Williams, they're not going to deny that speed, and Brown has plenty of it. That kid is a blazer. The same can be said for Anderson. But on the defensive side, you have a Shamar James, who apparently looks like Alabama is by far and about the favorite. Now, things could change, but from everything we're hearing, this is a kid who could be committing to Alabama sooner rather than later if everything holds up. Alabama has to finish this one, but they are in a phenomenal position for a very talented kid. Shamar James is interesting because he was originally being recruited to Alabama as an outside linebacker. However, now that has changed. changed. He is now being recruited to the Crimson Tide at an inside linebacker. This is something we are going to have to keep up with, because this is a name that I wouldn't be surprised at all within the next few weeks if we see an alert that Shamar James has committed to the Crimson Tide. That's how much I've been told he enjoyed his visit there, and that's how much the coaching staff feels, and people around the program feel confident that they are in a phenomenal position with the very talented defensive player. But if we look at some other news that is really, really important for the Crimson Tide as it pertains to recruiting, that's why I brought up the Crimson Tide being named as the #1 institution in development per the 24/7 Sports article. Now, this article was really fascinating, and it broke down through previous years how institutions have been so effective at getting guys, developing guys, and then sending them to the NFL draft. And Alabama was named #1. And while that is incredibly impressive, and then when you look at the way they're able to do it, incredibly impressive, and 24/7 Sports actually assigns each institution a number. And one of the really cool things about this is that every institution that they've assigned with a .90 or higher are teams that they deem able to make the playoffs. They have the talent, they have the development, they have just the general ability to make the college football playoffs. Alabama sits at a 1.13, far exceeding that .9 threshold. But the most telling stat that I really want to focus on when we're talking about this #1 institution in player development was actually pertaining to the 5 stars, because the development rate at 5 stars at the University of Alabama is absolutely staggering compared to the nation. At the University of Alabama, a 5-star has a 51.5% chance to exit the University of Alabama and be selected as a first-rounder within the NFL draft. Now, if you were to remove Alabama from the national average so that their numbers didn't count, that average of a 5-star being developed at any other program, you have about a 21.2% chance of being a first-round draft pick if you are a 5-star. Over double the chance at Alabama to be selected as a first-rounder as a 5-star at any other institution in the nation. That's wild. Now, look, obviously that stat, the second one, the 21.2%, is an average, so we'd have to aggregate it for each institutional. And look, naturally, that 21.2 is an average. If we wanted to look at Ohio State or Oklahoma, that number could be higher, but you get my point. If the national average for developing 5 stars into first-rounders is 21.2% and Alabama's is 51.5%, that absolutely explains why they continue to be such a mark for how players are developed and how an institution is ran, because that is incredible. But this is only one of the great news that Crimson Tide got, because the Crimson Tide also found out today that Nick Saban has extended his contract through 2028. And the reason why I brought up in the intro of this video that this could be big for recruiting now is because institutions, and this isn't new, but institutions have been pitching that Saban is on the verge of retiring. You'd be surprised how many times I've heard, oh, well, Saban might be on the verge of retiring, and now all that is put to bed by signing this contract extension through 2028. To me, Saban is sending a clear message to recruiting and the college football world that he's not looking to give up his reign anytime soon. Because of this, don't be surprised if some recruits are more inclined to commit to Alabama now, or are more inclined to more seriously look at the Crimson Tide, because another institution could have planted a seed of doubt about how long Saban would be there, and Saban just took that seed of doubt and took that recruiting pitch away from all these other institutions by signing this contract extension. So when you look at this holistically about the weekend Alabama had, you lose a running back to the transfer portal, 2 of them, in Keelan Robinson and Kyle Edwards through the last week, but not only do you have the #1 running back committed to you in the class of 2022, you pick up a 4-star top 100 player in the nation, running back LeVeon Moss out of Louisiana, which is going to be a massive addition to this Crimson Tide backfield. So if you're a Crimson Tide fan, with all of the news that you've received from Sunday into this Monday morning, you have to feel great about how your week is starting, and you still have plenty of insanely talented visitors set to step foot on the capstone this week. That's it. See ya.